Welcome to the STATMed podcast, where we teach you how to study in med school and how to pass board-style exams. Your hosts are Ryan Orwig and David LaSalle, learning specialists who have decades of experience working with med students and physicians. This episode is part 2 of a 2-part conversation with Ryan and Jim Culhane from Notre Dame of Maryland University's School of Pharmacy. They talk about one of the most important study skills for medical students and professionals, retrieval practice. If you haven't checked out part 1, we'd encourage you to listen to that first.
Failing is actually a really good thing. It's the way that we learn. We don't learn necessarily very well through our successes, but we learn so much through our failures. And the key thing is to fail in a controlled, low-stakes environment, right?
Here's Ryan.
I think it's important that we understand that there are these inherent challenges to the art of teaching these highly important skills to students in this arena. Now, let me just, before we pivot, I think there's a big difference between what you do, which is coaching students while they're in the middle of the semester, versus what I do. I don't work with students when they're in the semester. We work in the spaces in between. We work when they're on break, in between semesters, in the summer, in the winter, on break. If they're having to repeat, that's when they come to us. It lets us sort of pull the, I see people like you've got the canoe going down the river and they've got leaks in it, and you're trying to help them plug those leaks while it's still in stream. Whereas we're like, hey, the leaks are so bad, let's pull it out of the river. Let's fix this whole thing up and put it back in. So it's different, but the same. There's just different avenues and different contexts in which we sort of intervene, and I think both are really important and really viable.
Ryan, I think that you work with a lot of our students every year with your in terms of our PHRD 616 course. You come in and teach your methodology, and I think students that are really struggling and that really need to retool everything that they're doing, especially if they're really not gaining traction with anything that they're doing. I think that it's really, really important to be able to pull them out of the water, like you said. You've got to be able to, pause and learn these new skills and practice them. And then get back in the water and start paddling downstream again.
Yeah, I mean, I think both, like I said, both of these sort of modalities of intervening for students, they're both extremely valuable. They can work together. They can work in isolation. I just think that I try to be a voice to, number one, let people know if you're in one of these programs, if you're in med school, vet school, PharmD, and you are struggling, it makes sense a lot of times. It makes sense. It's such an astronomical jump from whatever undergrad or master's or biomed program you were in to going to these programs. And so many people don't have the methods in place. And there are a lot of things you can do. There are a lot of different strategies that can be combined, mixed and matched, interchanged with each other to really elevate that overall performance. So when we do talk about teaching retrieval practice, I thought now maybe you and I would just, share 3 different retrieval practice strategies. And look, if you're listening to this and this is, what we say might be more than enough to really ignite in you the ability to use these, or, you might need to do a deep dive into the website and look at some of the stuff that we have on there, or of course, you can always get a hold of me and talk to me about these things. But anyway, so I don't know, I guess I'll go first. One of the simplest things that we do is we call it a basic self-test. We'll use the word self-test interchangeably with retrieval practice.
And I use the term active recall too. That's another term that you hear. So these are all, I think, 3 interchangeable terms.
Is active recall the term that's most commonly in the literature, or is it retrieval practice?
No, I've seen all 3, to tell you the truth. So, I think that's a good point to make sure that everybody understands that we're talking about the same thing, whether we're talking about retrieval practice, self-testing, or active recall.
Yeah, and I sort of got away from using the word self-testing because I think people have such a negative association with the word test. Like I'll have students say, I don't want to do a self-test because I might not do well.
Well, and that's, and you said before when we talked about barriers, I mean, that is a huge barrier, the psychology of all of this, and that fear of failing. And that's something that I have to really have conversations with my students about and saying, look, failing is actually a really good thing. It's the way that we learn. We don't learn necessarily very well through our successes, but we learn so much through our failures. And the key thing is to fail in a controlled, low stakes environment, right?
Brilliant.
That's the key. And so when you do your failing there, so that when you get to the exam or you get to the assessment or whatever it is that you're doing that's high stakes, you've already failed. You've moved past that.
Well, the attempts at failure are how we learn. Imagine like a kid. Imagine a kid eyeballing a bicycle. Like, I would love to ride that bicycle. And they just like sit there and like, you're like, what are you doing, kid? They're like, I'm thinking about that bike. It's like, get on the bike. Get on the bike. Try, fail, try, fail, try, fail. All of a sudden you're riding a bike. Little kids are learning engines. So little kids are not as afraid of failure. When you get these like really successful students who then get into these arenas and they're used to never messing up, and especially once they start to get rocked a little bit with some struggling in school, in med school and PharmD school, then they're even less likely to be okay with quote unquote failing, right? Attempts at recall failure.
And I love your example. Just kind of cued me in about the little kids and learning things, because I think here's an important point about failure. Failing without expert feedback is not a good thing, right? Because you can end up just failing over and over and over again and not being able to fix the little things that are going on. A great example, my teenage son, he loves to skateboard, and I've never even been on a skateboard in my life, so I know nothing about skateboarding other than I'd probably break my neck if I tried it. But he's gotten into it, and he's trying to learn these tricks like called an ollie and a kick flip and all these things. And he practices all the time and over and over again. And sometimes he gets frustrated. And so what I do is, I'll videotape him, or not videotape, but I'll video him using my iPhone, put it on slow motion so that we can watch him. And then we'll go to YouTube and watch a pro do it and compare. And so that kind of feedback, so that the next time he practices it, he's able to do better instead of repeating
getting more deliberate. So how does that translate, do you think, to a student trying to deploy some retrieval practice in studying?
Right. So, I think, well, you mentioned it. I think that there's a couple of components to retrieval practice that, is really important if you're going to do it correctly. It's got to be, you've got to do that self check, right? So, as you're doing the self test or some of these techniques we're going to be talking about, it's really important to do an immediate self check of your answer for what I tell my students: depth, breadth, and accuracy, right? Okay.
Beautiful. Exactly. And that's what I was lobbing that up there for you.
Yeah, exactly. That's really important, right?
You don't, right. The expert is the source material you're checking against. You don't have to have some PhD explaining it to you. You just need to check the source.
Unless you don't understand it, that's the other piece too.
Right.
And I think that's one other thing too that I think is real important for your listeners to understand. And I want to reinforce, because when I work with faculty and I do faculty development in this area, sometimes you'll get pushback about this because it sounds very similar to memorization, which in higher ed, rote memorization, bad word in higher ed, and I get it. But the example that I give them all the time is that, okay, to me, rote memorization is being able to remember facts without contextual understanding. So, for example, you could memorize 6 different Russian vocabulary words and not have a clue what they mean, and remember them and repeat them back later on. To me, that's rote memorization. Retrieval practice is really bringing those words to the forefront of your mind, maybe using them in a sentence, understanding their meaning. How are they connected to one another? So that when you do that in your retrieval practice, it's not just about rote memorization, but it's really about contextual learning, right? And really trying to think more deeply about what you're remembering. Because the more connections that you make, right, between the information you're trying to recall and prior knowledge that you have in your long-term memory, the stronger that information will be encoded into your long-term memory, and the longer you're going to be able to hold on to it and use it more effectively.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I understand the fear of rote memory, and I don't think that's
right. I know how you feel about that, but I think some people, when they hear retrieval practice, they're like, "Oh, this is just a buzz. This is a buzzword for rote memorization."
Oh, you and I are both making the truth. Yeah, you and I are both making like stink faces. Like, no, that's not.
No, that's not right.
That's a good point as well. So anyway, I use the basic self-test. Basic self-test is like real simple. You pick something and you attempt to recall it. And I like having like numeric prompts, like, oh, there's 8 things I need to recall from this, or like there's 3 subcategories with 4 things each under it, like some of those kind of things. And we talk about maybe you can, as you're in lecture or reading, you can delineate those things, those missing categorical layers, we call them. And then you can quiz yourself off that stuff. As you're reading, instead of underlining and highlighting, you're like, oh, okay, this little paragraph is really talking about like risk factors, and there's 8 of them. And it's talking about, instead of like highlighting all 8, no, there's just 8 of them. Maybe I number them. And then when I'm coming back to self-test, I'm like, what are those 8 risk factors under this category? Boom, 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 boom. Oh, I got 4. I forgot 4. I got 4. I picked 2 that aren't part of it, and I forgot the other 2. And then the self-check corrects it. And then you can toggle with that. You can toggle back. Like, you can read for a little while, and when you start to get tired, start to zone out, instead of like, let me read something else, say, let me just go back to the previous 30 slides I just did, or 20 slides or 10 slides, and let me find some stuff to self-check, do basic self-tests on. And I do that for maybe 5-10 minutes, and I just pick up and resume my reading. That's a small, simple way to use retrieval practice while in the middle of studying, to change gears, to keep you in control of the learning, keep you relatively on task, but to make it more dynamic. It's more like cross-training with the studying. So that's what, it's obviously a very simplified version of the basic self-test. What is one that you might use?
Yeah, so I mean, that's really the question that I asked myself when I started, when I first met you, and I began to understand a lot more about what you do and the methodology that you teach. Is like, as a teacher, I'm sitting here thinking to myself, okay, this makes a ton of sense. And I'm looking at the literature, I'm like, wow, there's a ton of great empirical scientific evidence out there to support that this really works well. And so the next question as an educator is, how do I teach my students, right, how to do this? And in a way that's easy and accessible and maybe even familiar to them. So, as I started to think about that a little bit, it came to me that in some cases, we were actually doing retrieval practice in our classrooms through active learning techniques or pedagogy that we were using in our classrooms. Things like the minute paper is a technique that I talk to my students about, and we use that in a lot of our classes. Mid-lecture, we might stop after we've talked for a few minutes about a complex topic. We'll tell our students to pull out a piece of paper or bring up a blank word sheet, and for 1 minute, type down everything that you can remember about what we just talked about and write a paragraph about it. So it's not just about remembering facts and information, but it's contextualizing it. It's describing it in your own words. And this is really related to another evidence-based learning strategy that's called elaboration. And it's just explaining. You can do verbal elaboration, you can do written elaboration. And so my students, because they were familiar with that technique that we used in the classroom, like, oh yeah, Dr. So-and-so does this in their class. I'm like, absolutely. And guess what? You can do it while you're studying too.
I love it as an instructional tool. Like, why is this not just a part of our culture? We're like, at some point, the professor's going to be like, all right, hold on a second, write this out, and then self-check it. I mean, that should be a part, like 3 times a lecture. Like, it's going to happen. I feel like it would keep you more on your toes, and it would demand that sort of synthesis, recall attempt, failure, elaboration, then self-check and corrective, and then you move on. I like the idea of like tying back into material through retrieval practice in various capacities as you're moving forward. It just ties it all in better. But as you say, and look, we're not. Every day I talk to students, and every day students are upset about their professors or their schools or the med school changed their curriculum, or this professor is terrible. I'm like, doesn't matter. Like, okay, air it out. I'll listen to it. I hear you and I feel for you, but it's not changing. It's not changing. So air out your grievances and then say, what can I do as the learner in the cockpit driving this thing do to make it better for me? And
Absolutely.
A 1 minute, like drop out, say like during, especially if it's like on-demand lecture you're watching right now, boom, pause. What do I remember? Boom, 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 press start, carrying on. Studying on your own. I'm in the middle of reading. Let me just stop, jam out that white, the 1 minute paper, boom, boom, boom. What do I remember? But you self-check it and then you move on. It's great. And that ties in. So number 3, our third one, my second one here, would be what we call the time self-lecture. And it's very similar to the basic self-test, except we add a timer. I like 3 minutes. And people are like, I've seen people try to do stuff that's like, it's like watching a kid try to put a whole hamburger in their mouth in one time. Like, why couldn't I get through it in 3 minutes? It's because you chose 50 slides. I mean, you got to learn like what's like enough, like Goldilocks, not too little, not too much, just right. Let me pick like a sizable amount that's going to make me really push to try to get through it in 3 minutes. So you got the ticking clock, and I want them to talk out loud and write it, and it can be very abbreviated in some sort of fashion. Like I think of like on a whiteboard, like you're organizing it on a blackboard or something, but like numbers, abbreviations. So it's making you go through all these hoops. So the act of talking it out, like if you can't say it, you don't know it. You're going to be evaluated eventually talking out loud when you get to like rotations and stuff like that.
Absolutely, exactly.
Why are you not practicing that? You ask people like, how often do you practice? Like, never. Like, I'm not trying to make you feel ashamed. I'm just pointing it out. Talking out loud, and then that's another sensory modality. It's like, coming up through the vocal cords, out through the ears, all good. But if you can't say it, you don't know it. Having to write stuff down is another complication. It makes it easier to self-check, because if you didn't put something there, then you're not allowed to count it. All while operating under that timer ticking down, because the joke I make, which I enjoy, it's not even a joke. I'm just like, because you're never evaluated under time circumstances, are you? Because people are like, well, I don't have enough practice questions. Like, I don't care about practice questions. This stuff is what really matters. If you are doing this kind of stuff, thinking under time pressure, it's the whole ball game. So I think the goal should be, whatever the sequences of your study, it should all be to get to retrieval practice. Ideally, some kind of like you said, like the 1 minute paper, the time self-lecture, so that you're actually burning and pushing to get through a retrieval mechanism, retrieval circuits under some kind of time pressure. So that's another one on my end. What's another one you might be able to?
Yeah, and that's what you mentioned there too is again another one of those evidence-based learning strategies. It's called dual coding. Exactly what the 3 minute lecture utilizes, and it's really, really effective. I think another one.
Can you define dual coding? Or is it just basically
dual coding? It's you did a great job, I think, explaining the concept in your example there. It's an evidence-based learning strategy that takes advantage of multiple modes of input, sensory input, right? Dual meaning two coding. So you're as you pointed out, you've got the audio from your talking out the concept out loud, and then you've got the mechanics of writing or drawing, so the kinesthetic input. And so together, we think that actually enhances encoding of information more than either one of those by themselves.
So again, like, why not bring that in? I mean, these students we have, they're studying all day. They're studying all the time. Or you're not studying all the time, and you want to get the most bang for your buck when you are. I mean, why not do things that emphasize best encoding practice? Encode, put it in, retrieve, access, pull it out. That's the whole shebang, really. So that's what I think everybody wants to. I think on the professor side, this is what we want our students to do. On the student side, this is where you're spending your time is your currency. That's like the scarce resource. So you want to be able to get the bang for your buck while you're there. Okay, what's another one?
So another one that's really, really interesting that has evolved for me is the empty outline technique. Again, this is another one of those classroom activities that professors can use with their students to help them to practice retrieval in the classroom. So basically all the empty outline is if your slides or your handouts are in an outline format, you go in and you empty them out. You empty out the details and leave blank spaces. And then the student's job is to try to remember what goes into those blank spaces.
Yeah.
Right? And so This particular technique early on was really appealing to me because it forced the student to actually use the learning materials that I was giving them in class, or that their instructor was giving them in class. So in other words, the PowerPoint presentations or the handouts. They weren't recreating something like recopying their notes or creating these elaborate tables or whatever that takes a lot of time to do.
But it's a lot of clerical time. It's a lot of clerical time recopying that feels productive, but you're not really. It's not high yield learning.
No, you don't get very much return on your time investment with stuff like that. So my whole idea was, how can we more efficiently do this by using the materials that students have? And so I started teaching that technique to a number of the students that I was coaching at the time. And as they were practicing this technique, they were coming back and saying, Dr. Culhane, this is working, but it takes me so long to empty out these outlines or PowerPoint presentations, go in and delete everything.
That's the clerical demand. That becomes the office work, clerical demand that we're trying to avoid, right?
Right. And so here's the really neat part about the story, and I know you and I have had this experience also, is that one of the students I was coaching and working with, he came back to me one day. He said, you know what, I've got this idea. He said, instead of deleting everything, he said, what I did is I just went into PowerPoint and drew boxes, colored boxes over the text to, sort of like using a piece of paper to cover up a printed out note, right? Note page. And he said it was a lot faster in that way. And I thought that was a real kind of brilliant, innovation with that. And, as I started to think about ways we could improve on that, I added a lot of different elements to it, and it evolved into a retrieval practice technique that you and I have talked about before, is what I call the boxing and unboxing technique, which we might get into in another podcast or discussion.
Yeah, no, I think we're going to build something out on this. This idea of using boxes in PowerPoints is absolutely fascinating. It's a great tool that you've sort of explained it to me on the fly, and we looked at it a little bit. I was like, oh, this is something. So, and you call it what are you calling it?
I call it boxing and unboxing. So basically, there's two parts to it. Yeah, boxing and so you're boxing the lecture. You're boxing the lecture up essentially. You're going through each slide. You're drawing squares or rectangles in PowerPoint over key pieces of information that you need to retrieve. And then inside the boxes, what you're doing is you're creating what I refer to as retrieval cues. Okay. These are prompts or questions that will help you to retrieve or remember that information. So, maybe you're covering up the definition of a term, and in the box you write, define this term, or you might even write, how does this term relate to another concept, or why is this important?
It's great. So and some of that ties into what we call the missing categorical layer.
Yeah.
So, because I feel like what happens with these experts, like the categories and subcategories get obscured. So what we want, like, okay, this is definitional. This is, what are the causes? Let's say we're like looking at cystic cirrhosis or whatever. Like, what are the definition, the cause, transmission, results, epidemiological information, diagnostic stuff, all that. Like, because I think we should teach students to read as they're reading, because you got to read it once, and then learn how to seek and break and pull out those missing categorical layers and identify them. And we want to put those either on the side, in the margins, or you put it on top of the box.
Or you're making a judgment call about what to box out, how to box it out, what type of question or retrieval cue to put in the box. And it's really interesting you mentioned that, because I think that the processes are very, very closely related. And I didn't think about that in that way, but I think that that's really important. You're unconsciously, like you've always said, kind of building that blueprint or superstructure, right?
Yeah, we call it framework. I feel
framework, right? That's what you guys call it, right?
Yeah, and my theory of like learning is about, like, I think a lot of our med students in the PharmDs and vets we work with, their brains don't build those frameworks automatically.
No.
Whereas I think most people in the field do, but I think a lot don't. If you don't, then you need to do it overtly, right?
Yeah, and especially if your professor's a mess too, and their lecture notes are a mess and totally disorganized, and there's no organization or structure to it. That only adds a layer, right?
Yes,
of difficulty.
it's a layer of, it's like obfuscation, and you can't see it and you can't find it, and it's just a mess. So this idea of seeking and finding also makes the reading act much more engaged.
Yes.
Because trying to read and memorize it's not really how it works. So if you're like seeking and finding and extracting, it turns into a scavenger.
Analysis. It's yes. Analysis what you're doing.
You're unlocking the critical analytical side of your brain and engaging it by default, which is really powerful. Now again, go ahead.
Oh no, so I wanted to finish up the unboxing side of things, right? So after you've gone through your PowerPoint presentation, your Word handout, and you've covered things up in squares, and you've typed in your retrieval cues, the next thing to do is to unbox the lecture, unpackage it. And so that means going slide by slide and using those retrieval cues to try to remember what's under the box or describe. Right, it's recall, right? And one of the neat things about it that I was so excited, it kind of hit me, is that the color coding system that we came up with for the boxes, right? Which allows you to track your learning. And you mentioned this at the beginning of our discussion about that data strip that should come out of your brain telling you, okay, you've encoded this, and how do we do that? Well, when you unbox the lecture in this technique, if you successfully retrieve all the information underneath the box, I instruct my students to turn that box to the color green, indicating you're good to go. If you have partial recall, you change it to yellow. And if you can't recall anything at all, you change it to red. And then you've got your fourth color, which is your default color that you used when you first covered the box up, that just indicates that you have not attempted retrieval on that material. And so what students can do now is they can track their learning on a day-to-day basis.
Inherently without a huge time cost. So so you and I will get together on this, and this will be built out, and you'll be able to find it on the website. And then we'll probably do a deeper dive talk into it, because I think it's absolutely fascinating. So that's boxing and unboxing. Is that what that's what you're calling? Okay, beautiful.
Yep.
All right. So now, like I said, moving forward, last one for me, I would say we use voice flash cues. So that's using your phone.
Yeah.
Especially if you're at a board prep level, and you're reading and you're seeing all this high yield information being laid out like in the explanations. You're like, what do I do with all these fragments of information? The idea is you can do this in any regard. You can do it while you're studying in lecture, like after studying information after lecture, however you like it. And you basically are turning factoids into question answer files, and you're just reading them into your phone. And then you can listen to them on the go when you have a commute, light physical labor, light workouts, go for a walk, and you can be quizzing yourself, question, answer, question. So you listen to the question, pause it, attempt to recall the answer, then hear the answer. Boom, 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 boom in a circuit. I think of that as something as a boost, as a bonus, not as a primary learning strategy. But it can be a really powerful resource for people, especially if you're really in a crunch studying and you feel like I don't have time to do anything other than study. Well, now you can make something on the fly and then go do something a little healthy, even if it's just get out, walk around, get on a treadmill, whatever might float your boat. Or if you have a long commute and you want to utilize that, don't just listen to a lecture. That's very low yield.
Right, and students do that all the time, and and I've talked to you a little bit about my philosophy or idea about the process of learning, right? And how students move through different stages of learning to achieve content mastery. And I think one of the things that I find with my students that are maybe struggling a little bit, they spend way too much time in that understanding phase of learning, where I don't understand something, so I can't start retrieval practice yet.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
No. They go hand in hand. You come out of class and you've got a certain level of understanding, hopefully, if you are conscious and awake and paying attention. But as you start to get into retrieval practice, and if you use some of these elaborative strategies that we talked about, your understanding will grow as you're encoding that information into long-term memory, right?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's really important, is this idea of not waiting for dead mastery to move on. You've got to be okay understand. It's almost like your learning has to be like a crude hypothesis. And the only way to really test it is by trying it, building it. And that should be through attempting recall. Yeah, it's like, I don't know. I feel like it's like somebody who goes to the weight room for 3 years straight and they never increase the weights.
Yeah.
Like we had a buddy of mine growing up. We were out in our senior year, and he'd been going to the gym. He'd been working out his entire high school career, and somebody talked about like increasing their bench press or something. He's like, wait, what? And they're like, yeah, like, you increase it as you work out throughout the. He's like, oh, they're real quiet. Like, what? Why? Why do you say that? He's like, he was like, I never increased the weight. And we were like, over how long? He was like, all of it. So he was still benching and curling and squatting the same amount for 3 years. This guy, by the way, shows up at our, like, there's like, didn't show up at our 10-year high school reunion. We didn't know where he went. He was like working at a bar. Showed up at our 20-year high school reunion. Now look, at your 20-year high school reunion, there's gonna be some people that show up and they're doctors, and it's like obvious.
Yeah.
And there's gonna be one person that shows up and they're a doctor, and it's equally hilarious and terrifying. that was him.
Really?
Yeah. It was awesome. It was awesome. Super smart. We didn't know.
Wow.
And
wow.
yeah. I mean, great. Like it was awesome, But it's this idea of I just got to keep doing the same thing without adding the resistance, adding the struggle, adding the failure. Right. That's where we grow. That's where it grows. And so this idea of like I've got to keep it steady the whole way. No. Overburden, fail, mess up, readjust, and obviously it'll get better as you go, even though it won't be pretty. Learning should not be super pretty. It should be a little ugly. It should be a little messy.
And that's a really great point that you bring up about retrieval practice, is that one of the conditions for successful retrieval practice that we know is introducing what Robert Bjork and his wife Elizabeth call desirable difficulties, right?
Yeah.
Right. And so this is important. So if retrieval practice, and I love your weight room analogy, right? If retrieval practice is easy, right? And you can do it without much effort, you're not getting much benefit to it. It's very passive.
And so that was like the reason I brought in that awkward analogy about my buddy, like, because it, like, working out had to be pretty easy for him for like at least 2.5 years, and he never like caught on.
And so he didn't gain a lot from that, right? Oh, exactly.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's like, man, you're spending an awful lot of time in the gym. You know, where's the yield? But it's right. It's about understanding this desirable difficulty, and that is a great word to really anchor.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. In fact, if you've got any sophisticated readers out there, people that like to dive into the literature, anything that Bob or Elizabeth Bjork has written is definitely worth looking into. They're really at the top of the field with regards to things like retrieval practice, metacognition, and learning.
So and then just talking about those voice flash cues. I mean, I know it sounds a lot like Anki, and Anki's great because Anki is like an automated thing. There's already files out there.
Yep.
It's detail oriented. Some of it might even go straight to audio. If that works for you, great. Let me just say this quickly as a caveat, and I'll elaborate on this elsewhere. Anki does not always work for everyone. I think Anki is really good for bottom-up learners, people who can learn from the details and then assimilate them into a framework subconsciously. But I meet a lot of people and they're like, it's like the emperor has no clothes on type of thing. They're like, why is everybody swearing by this and it doesn't work for me? Yeah. And usually those are top-down learners, and they need an explicit framework. They need to be able to seek and find and build that framework themselves. And then the details will go in more fluidly and quickly and with better encoding and retrieval. But I just want to make sure that we understand that when I talk about something like voice flash cues, like it's very similar to Anki, both of those are detail oriented. And if you are someone and that detail first learning doesn't work, it's okay. It makes sense. But it's often because of that. It's like that framework building mechanism is just not as innate in that learner.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think another important piece that you bring up as well too, we have retrieval practice tools like flashcards, Anki, Quizlet. Those things are all available. There's lots of apps out there now that help you with retrieval practice. And I think that one of the things that, again, if you go to the scientific literature about retrieval practice, and Robert Bjork talks about this as well too, is that you don't, especially if there's a long period of time in between assessments. If you're a student, right, and you've got exams every month, every 4, 5, 6 weeks, okay?
Yeah.
Or maybe you have one at the midterm and one at the end of the semester. Using the same retrieval practice strategy to study for that course over and over again can be very, very ineffective, because you develop something that the cognitive psychologists call automaticity. And so, the retrieval becomes essentially automatic versus effort.
And you're losing the desirable difficulty, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so the way to beat that, and you have this built into your system, and that's why I really like what you and Dave teach, is the different methods for retrieval practice. So you can mix it up if you vary it. Now, for my students that I work with, they've got exams about every 2 weeks, major exams. I don't necessarily think, at least in my experience, that for many of them that's long enough for that automaticity to develop, because most of them aren't hitting their material every single day, spacing it out on a daily basis. There's still probably some cramming and blocking going in there. But, for any longer periods of that, I might suggest using multiple retrieval practice strategies.
That's great. Yeah, that's why you're on here. That's why you're on here, Jim, for bringing those.
And like I said, I'm not, Ryan, I am absolutely no expert on this at all. This is not my area of expertise. I have no formal training and education other than, what I've learned over the years in reading the literature. And
but you brought your PhD brain into this, and the way that you read and consume, the literature is truly valuable. And being an aggregator and a sharer of that information is really valuable.
Absolutely. All I'm trying to do is in the best way and the most accurate way that I can is.
But you've got your own little lab now, because you've got your students coming in to see you, and that's like I told you when you took on this position, I was like, you're going to love it, because you're getting live, real world experience and live, real world feedback working with those students, and that just levels you up, right? Just in the
absolutely, and I think that's really the difference too. You and I have talked in the past too. I mean, there's a lot of really good information on YouTube and on the web about retrieval practice, and then there's some really poor information out there about it. And I think that it's really, really important if you're a student looking for this kind of information, is to really evaluate your source material that you're getting. And, and some students, all they need to do is listen to a 15 or 20-minute YouTube video, and they might be able to pick it up, right? It's like the gifted athlete. You can teach them, right, how to shoot a goal from midfield, right, in 15 minutes, and they've got it. But for most students, especially if you're struggling, it's really, I think, important to engage with an expert, someone who can help guide you through the process, provide you with feedback, and teach you different methodologies and strategies to do that.
And unfortunately, I mean, the world we live in, there's, not all experts are the same.
Right.
You do have to be discerning, and just because somebody might have like some credentials, it doesn't mean if they're telling you something and it's not clicking, it might be them and not you.
It's those thousands of hours that you've accumulated working with students that struggle, that you've built that mental database of how to diagnose, how to steer students in the right direction. And, for you, again, what always amazes me as I think back on our, kind of our journey together, is that, you were really promoting this stuff to us years before it was really becoming mainstream. And so, that's that time. That time in place, really working with it is hugely beneficial.
Yeah, I guess it does put me ahead of the curve, because I've been
definitely, absolutely, without a doubt, I think.
Yeah, it's weird. I don't think about it. It's like that's just the way I see the world.
Yeah.
So, but you're right. Yeah, I mean, I guess I was swimming in that into the pool by myself for quite some time, and I had so many students coming to me that gave me. You used the word outlier earlier, but I think I'm actually an outlier by Malcolm Gladwell's definition, because I was an early adopter of these skills. I had all kinds of time with my med students and my physicians who were struggling, and my PharmD students. And then I started building solutions earlier than I think a lot of people did. So I think
and then refining them over and over again over years. I mean, that's
incessantly and maddeningly continuing to revise and fix and
rebuilding based upon that feedback that you get from your students. That's really, and that's really, you told me that, and it's really paid off a lot, because a lot of what I learn and a lot of the changes that I made to methodologies that I recommend to students are based upon the feedback that I get from them. Hey, this is working. Because look, you can come up with the greatest system in the world to teach students how to do retrieval practice. But if they can't do it, if it's not practical, or they don't want to do it, or they're intimidated by it, it's worthless. It's worthless.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, and that is the magic piece, is like, are you listening to your students? And that's why, I have relationships with students from 15 years ago. And I still, they're text me today, I have a buddy, one of my guys, I guess he's a friend of mine now. Like, he lives in Florida, and he drives 45 minutes each way to go to work in the emergency department. And he'll just call me, and we'll talk about other stuff too, but we also talk about what we're doing with STATMed and what he can do if he can contribute, or he's got a test he wants to talk about. But it's fascinating. Awesome. If I don't have that feedback, how am I going to know? And that's kind of how we built all of this, was listening and continuing to listen to our students. So, all right, well, I think this has run long enough. I've taken enough of your time.
No, it's been great. Like I said, I love talking about this stuff. I kind of nerd out on it, and that's why I enjoy talking to you about it.
Yeah, this is not that different from conversations you and I have been having just one-on-one for the last 10 years. So
absolutely,
just recorded it this time. So we'll have you back on here for sure, and we will dive into your boxing and unboxing, and we'll do something like that too, because I think that's pure gold. So thank you for sharing your time and talking with us, and we'll have you back on here soon.
Thank you, Ryan. Take care.
Thanks for tuning in to the STATMed podcast. If you like this show, we hope you'll subscribe. You can find more test taking and studying strategies specifically developed for med students and physicians over at our blog on statmedlearning.com. Thanks for listening.
Hey there, Ryan Orwig from STATMed Learning. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, we'd appreciate it if you'd hit the thumbs up button below, and we'd love to hear from you, so leave us a comment with your thoughts. To make sure you don't miss future studying and test-taking tips for the medical field, be sure to subscribe to our channel. And when you do, turn on alerts by clicking the bell icon. Thanks again.